Hello, my name is Glynn Stockton. I'm an international lecturer in design at Lancaster University, and this is my presentation on visual aesthetics and design in Warhammer 40,000 for the 2025 Warhammer Conference. The official title is Skulls, Gothic Futures and the Weight of Iron, but an alternative title could be Why Warhammer 40K Looks the Way It Does in 2025. That, I hope, is your takeaway from this presentation. I'm going to go through 9 different sections: manufacturing limitations, the Primaris scale and the impact that had. I'm going to talk a little bit about Grim Dark, but there are other presentations at the conference that talk more about that. I'm going to talk about the thinking limitations, semiotics, and material perceptions of the designers of the Warhammer 40K universe. I'm going to mention the passage of time and how that's represented, the visual syntax of the miniatures, and then a little bit of homework. So, 1987, first edition, this is how it started, and this is what it looked like. The miniatures were quite simple affairs, white metal from molds that had been taken from hand-carved miniatures. The issue here is twofold. Firstly, with the molds being taken from hand-carved miniatures, it meant that the level of surface detail was low, the intricacy was low, the overall character was quite simple in style. And then, because the metal is put into the mold under atmospheric pressure, it's not forced into all the nooks and crannies, so we don't get high fidelity within the model either. And then, because of the manufacturing process, it limits the amount of detail with undercuts and other issues that can affect the release of the model from the mold. So that's how we ended up with these miniatures looking the way that they did. And then, of course, the artwork had to reflect that. So the posters, the codexes, everything had to look the way that the miniatures did so that there weren't any false hopes being generated. There were some plastic models, but again, these were taken from the hand sculpted formers to start with. So very similar, kind of low fidelity, low surface detail. There were more parts to these, so there was more opportunity to have detail on the underside and reverse side, but these were quite rare because these are expensive to make. The second edition in 1993 actually exploited this pairing of the cheap, easy to manufacture metal bodies with small numbers of injection molded components to add that detail that was needed. So we had this blended material matrix in second edition. And then in third edition, we had the multi-part plastic kits really take off. There was a lot more of those because there was money in the business, so they could invest in the tooling to make the components. We also had the introduction of some digital sculpts, but this was only for small details. It wasn't for the whole thing. We had to wait until 2004 for that. Then fourth edition, we had the first complete digital sculpt, which was this Tyrannid Carnifex. So here he is here, fantastic model. And I can't stress enough how much this affected the aesthetic of the Warhammer universe. What we see here is a shift from drawing what they could make to making what they could draw. So all the early stuff, first edition, second edition, it's hand sculpted, it's atmospheric pressure, metal into a mold, really low detail. But then, with the introduction of digital sculpts, we get models which have a much higher level of detail. They were making what they could draw. This completely changed the look of Warhammer. In 2008, we see Finecast replacing metal. Finecast is a polyurethane resin, but it also goes in just under atmospheric pressure. Lots of issues, bubbles, incomplete casts. It was interesting to see that they reused the white metal molds, as evidenced here with these miniatures, but the Finecast was a bit of a stopgap before we start to see injection molded polystyrene. So in 2012, we have the introduction of push fit. Now, push fit is only achievable when you have very high manufacturing tolerances and accurate drawings to make the molds from. I think push fit was actually a great thing because it meant that people who had low dexterity or youngsters could easily assemble miniatures where they may have struggled before. And then in 2017, we've got the introduction of the Primaris scale, and this is the next big step. From a business perspective, it meant that everybody had to rebuy their armies, but from a manufacturing and design perspective, it meant that everything got bigger. So we had more space, we had better proportions, and we could use that space to add more detail if we wanted. We were drawing on a bigger canvas, if you will. We've got two of the starter Space Marines here, and you can see on these sprues how this translates to the model. So the 1993 version has 3 elements plus a base. Contrast that to the 2023 version, 30 years later, and we've got 8 elements plus a base. Far more detail, far more accuracy, and overall, a far more pleasing model. I know it's not got the character of the early ones, but what we're looking at is we're looking at how things have evolved into what we see today, and this is very much a part of that story. I'm going to talk a little bit about grimdark. Now, the aesthetic of Warhammer 40k, people do talk about this a lot, and we can see that actually in the early years, first edition through fifth edition, we've got a lot of color, we've got a lot of dynamicism. These are all the starter boxes, except the first edition, which didn't have a starter box, so that's a Space Marine box. But we can see how different they are to 6th through 10th edition, where I don't know what happened in 2012, but Dark Vengeance, and then 7th, which you may know is more of an evolution of 6th, through to Leviathan, the tone of the visual communication completely changed. So I'd be interested to see what happens in 11th. We can also talk about the thinking limitations. So the designers of Warhammer 40k, they are from certain societies, they have grown up with certain educations, they've got the corpus of material from the quite extensive Warhammer back catalogue to refer to. But as Graham Greene put it in 1938, brain was only capable of what it could conceive, and it couldn't conceive what it had never experienced. The way that that translates into the miniatures is summed up, I think, in this character here. So, if you don't know who this is Sly Marbo. And I think this is, well, it's a couple of things. It's an excellent example of how the designers are referencing material to create the miniatures. But I think this is one of the worst ways in which we can do that. So, if you don't know who Sly Stallone is, Sylvester Stallone, or if you're not familiar with the John Rambo franchise, then this in joke makes no sense to you. It's self-referential, and I think it's quite exclusionary. So it kind of excludes younger people, people from different cultures, and also when we look at what Warhammer is about, it's about immersion, it's about enjoyment, and taking you out of the everyday. This absolutely breaks that fourth wall. So for me, I'm not a fan of this kind of miniature. We can talk about the semiotic triangle. So human beings, the way that we navigate the world, we look at objects and we understand their significance through our perceptions of the signs, the signifiers. We then can create a concept. The way that translates to Warhammer, I've got an example here. So we've got this lovely stomper, and on the back of this stomper are these giant exhaust stacks. We've seen these before in our culture with these huge exhausts on trucks and things. And what does this tell us? It tells us that inside the stomper, there must be a vast engine powering this thing because it needs these huge exhausts. Um, so that's the concept. And we know that there isn't an engine inside the miniature. It's a plastic model. There's nothing inside there. But what the designers are doing is they're using these clues to try and suggest how things are operating 38,000 years from now. Another example of this, if we look at that stomper's bottom, then we have all of this armor plate. And we can see that the armor plate is very haphazard in style. It looks almost found. It looks like it's been repaired many times. And we can relate this to the kind of improvised armor that we saw in early armored vehicles. So the affordances of the materials, the idea that this is like a strong iron with the big rivets to give us these clues, this is something that we can relate to because we've seen the examples in our everyday life. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the passage of time is represented in Warhammer as well. So we're talking about something which we are led to believe is 38,000 years from now in the Warhammer 40k universe. In the Horus Heresy era, in Warhammer 30k, that's 10,000 years prior to that. And this is how the designers are communicating that difference in time. So in the 1920s and 1930s in Western countries, Art Deco and streamlined was hugely popular as an aesthetic style. And what the designers have done is they've taken that thing from our recent cultural past and they said, look, the difference between 30k and 40k is actually in 30k, they looked older because, and they're using these stylistic devices, the geometric forms, the symmetry, the balance, all the hallmarks of Art Deco and streamlining in the style of these miniatures here to suggest that they are older. So if you have a look at the front of this tank, how it mirrors the form of the Hudson Streamliner train. If you have a look at the Saturnine Dreadnought with that lovely symmetry and geometric form, absolute classic Art Deco references. We've got some more here as well. If we have a look at this miniature from the Mechanicum, and we can compare that to the whip robot that appeared in Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. That's another example of how the sort of Art Deco and streamlined style was used to represent a different timeline. Now, if you look at the heads of these two characters, they're virtually identical. So this is how the designers are suggesting a movement of time, an older aesthetic from 30k compared to 40k. Here's another example. The lovely Orc battle wagon from 1990 looks like it was dug up from a Roman site with those huge chariot wheels with the swords attached, big metal plates, lots of rivets, seemingly a ship's mast on there as well. This is something which suggests an old technology. If we compare that to the 2021 battle wagon, look at this visual language of this truck that we would recognize today as something with the cab, the wheels. Uh, the designers are suggesting that this 2021 version is a more modern version of the battle wagon compared to what was out in 1990. Let's have a look at the oldest faction in the Warhammer 40k universe. So we've got the Necrons here. How do you make the Necrons look old? Well, you reference the oldest cultures that we are aware of. So we have this ancient Egyptian aesthetic that's applied to the things that they use. It's really obvious, it's really transparent. I mean, they have scarab swarms as well within that faction, so it should be pretty apparent to you. But this is how the designers are saying, look, this is an ancient race, and they're using those visual cues from ancient races from our culture. We can look at the work of the designers on the Space Marines as well. So here we have Dante Alighieri's representation, the Divine Comedy of the passage of the soul through heaven and purgatory and hell, as written in Thomas Aquinas's writing from that era. In the medieval time, everything all energy, all built things, architecture, book illustrations, everything went towards showing how powerful the god was, the deity, and reminding you of your sinful ways, your lowly sinful ways. So the designers have taken this high Gothic aesthetic and applied it to the Space Marines because that's absolutely their mantra, that's their ethos. And sometimes the visual syntax is literal syntax, as we have Commander Dante here with his halo and the winged elements and things. So uh, quite literal. I don't know if you've been to Warhammer World, but we've got some of the scenery here, which again mirrors that very tall, with the Gothic arches, the kinds of buildings that have taken humans, decades or centuries to make during the medieval period. That's what they're doing here to suggest that the Space Marines, as a faction, have that kind of belief and using that Gothic medieval symbolism. If we contrast that to the chaos elements in Warhammer 40k, well, during that medieval period, um, Thomas Aquinas and other writers, they would compare ugliness and imbalance not only as being lesser to God, but actually being evil and being morally corrupt. And that's something that we buy into today as well. When we see things that are unbalanced or asymmetric, we see them not only as performing less of a function, but actually being, of a morally corrupt disposition. So this is how the designers are doing that in Warhammer 40k. There's no sort of numerical base, as in there's no proportions or mathematical devices you can use to represent these, like you can with the Gothic architecture that the Space Marines use. And this is very much the inverse to that medieval aesthetic. We've got the tribal barbarian orcs. They run on found technology. They have repurposed elements. They're using skulls and tusks and organic parts to keep their vehicles functioning and give them that style. And this is absolutely from the kind of the tribal or the barbaric aesthetic that we recognize today. And that tells us instantly what kinds of characters these are. We can look at another example here. If we compare this Speed Freaks poster with this Mad Max poster, the elements are virtually interchangeable because of this kind of dystopian aesthetic. And what about the newest faction or the youngest faction in the Warhammer 40k universe? So the Tau are basically running around in brand new consumer products. How do we show this? Look at the clean lines. Look at the white palette that's been used on this miniature from the Warhammer website. These are consumer products, industrial design. It looks very contemporary. It looks like something that Johnny Ive could have designed at Apple. There's no obvious signs of repair. These haven't seen sufficient action to need repair and replace and maintenance. And that is how the tower represented. So a lovely visual syntax, which absolutely contrasts, the ancient style of the Necrons, for example. So if we count Space Marines, loyalist Space Marines, as one faction, there are currently 22 on the Warhammer website. So what critical appraisal can you do on your favorite faction, thinking about the aesthetics, the visual syntax, the semiotics? What can you do to analyze your favorite faction? I think that'll be a fun thing to do. So, thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Thank you to the conference organizers as well. My name's Glynn Stockton, and that has been my presentation. I've got references for the images there. And I'll say thank you for your time. Thank you very much.